a city where power whispered through cigar smoke and secrets were traded like currency, one woman's love affair threatened to bring down the most powerful men in America. She wasn't just the mob's mistress. She was the spark that lit the fuse of political chaos. Before we dive into this tangled web of love, lies, and loyalty, hit that subscribe button and step with us into the shadows where crime and politics share the same bed. They say the most dangerous weapon in the underworld isn't a gun. It's a secret whispered in the wrong ear, and Judith Exner had plenty of those. Before the scandals, before the mob ties, before her name became a coded warning in Washington corridors, she was just a California girl with a movie star smile and dreams too big for her quiet world. The sunlit streets of Los Angeles in the 1940s painted a picture of glamour and promise. A place where girls like Judith believed anything was possible if they looked the part. Played the part and never blinked first. Judith Imore, as she was known then, grew up surrounded by the illusion of safety. Her father was a prominent architect. Her mother a socialite who cared deeply about appearances. The kind of woman who could turn dinner into a performance. Judith learned early that charm was currency and silence was survival. She carried herself like a secret waiting to be told, and that aura, that subtle air of mystery, would become her greatest asset and her greatest curse. By her early 20s, Judith had already caught the eye of Hollywood's elite. She was beautiful in that timeless, camera-ready way. Dark eyes that could hold you still, lips that seemed made for both truth and deception. But Judith wasn't after fame. Not really. She was after belonging. The kind of belonging that comes when powerful men say your name like it means something. The Hollywood parties were her classroom. She learned how to read the room. Who was important, who was pretending, and who could open the doors that really mattered. She could glide through a crowd of producers, senators, and mob-connected fixers like smoke. She laughed when they laughed, listened when they talked, and always left before anyone realized how much she had seen. And then there was Johnny Rosselli. The name carried weight. A suave, silver-haired gentleman who dressed like a movie star but belonged to a darker script. Johnny was a made man in the Chicago outfit, sent to the West Coast to keep the mob's interests tidy, casinos, studios, and everything in between. He had a taste for elegance, and Judith had a taste for danger. Their meeting wasn't an accident. In that world, nothing ever was. Rosselli saw in Judith what most men missed, a woman who understood silence better than loyalty. He drew her into his orbit, not with force, but with finesse. Dinners in dimly lit restaurants, car rides that smelled like tobacco and leather, and whispered promises of a life that danced between velvet and violence. She wasn't just a mistress. She was a message, a reminder that even the most powerful men could be tamed by beauty. Through Johnny, Judith was introduced to another world, one where favors replaced friendship and every handshake carried a secret. She began hearing names whispered like incantations. Giancana, Trafficante, Lansky, men whose decisions shaped empires from the shadows. She didn't yet know it, but she was stepping into a chessboard, where her life would become the most dangerous pawn. It was around this time that Judith's path crossed with a man whose charm outshone even Rosselli's, a young senator from Massachusetts, with ambition in his blood and danger in his smile, John F. Kennedy. Their introduction was orchestrated, not by fate, but by men who understood the value of influence. Rosselli, ever the strategist, saw potential in connecting two rising stars from very different worlds. Judith was to be the bridge, the beautiful go-between who could move effortlessly between politicians and the mob without raising suspicion. Kennedy was magnetic. To Judith, he didn't seem like a politician. He seemed like a story waiting to be written. He was confident but kind, powerful yet soft-spoken. And for a woman used to the rough edges of mob life, he felt like the polished dream she'd been chasing since those golden California afternoons. Their chemistry was instant, the kind of spark that makes you forget the consequences. But in the shadows of power, every secret has a cost. Judith began visiting him quietly. Private meetings, whispered phone calls, coded messages. The romance was intoxicating, but the world they lived in didn't allow for innocence. What began as love soon became leverage. Judith didn't know it then, but she had become the invisible link between the most powerful man in the free world and the men who controlled America's underworld. Each visit brought her deeper into a maze she couldn't escape. She wasn't just sleeping beside power. She was caught in its storm. She carried messages between men who never dared be seen together. Sometimes she thought it was all just coincidence. Other times she felt the cold edge of paranoia scraping at the back of her mind. Late at night, she'd stare out of her apartment window, city lights reflecting in her glass of scotch, and wonder how it had all happened. How the girl who once danced under the Hollywood sun had ended up here. A ghost in her own story, too valuable to ignore, too dangerous to trust. Rumors began to swirl in the dark corridors of D.C. The whispers were faint at first. A woman, a secret, a connection. But in the political underworld, whispers are earthquakes waiting to happen. The mob watched. The FBI listened. And Judith, she tried to stay invisible. She didn't understand that in a world built on secrets, being invisible was just another way of being hunted. Rosselli warned her. "These people," he told her once, his voice low, "they don't fall in love, Judy. They make investments." She laughed it off then, thinking it was just his jealousy speaking. But the words would come back to haunt her, again and again, as her name became entangled in the threads of assassination plots, intelligence schemes, and scandals too dark to print. In those early days, though, she was still naive enough to believe in the fantasy, to believe that she could live in both worlds, the mob's smoky underbelly and the polished halls of politics, without one devouring the other. But love and power don't share. Well, and Judith Exner was standing between two men who would rather destroy the world than lose control of it. The stage was set, the players in place, and as history would soon learn, one woman's affair would ignite a scandal that would blur the line between organized crime and organized government forever. What began as a love story under the California sun was about to turn into one of America's darkest secrets. A secret whispered between mobsters, presidents, and the ghosts they left behind. In Los Angeles, power didn't always wear a suit or carry a badge. Sometimes it wore diamonds, silk gloves, and a knowing smile. Judith had learned that early. By the time the 1950s turned into the early 60s, she had become a quiet fixture in rooms most people never even knew existed. She wasn't famous, but she was seen. She wasn't rich, but she was remembered. Hollywood wasn't just about the silver screen. It was a meeting ground for men who made deals that could shift the balance of cities, even nations. Judith moved through those rooms like a breeze that smelled faintly of Chanel and danger. She had a gift for listening without looking like she was listening, for smiling at the right moments, for disappearing before questions followed. Her connection to Johnny Rosselli had opened doors, but not the kind with red carpets and flashing bulbs. These were doors guarded by silence and favors. Behind them were the men who built empires out of casinos, politics, and blackmail. To them, Judith was more than decoration. She was a messenger, a distraction, and eventually, a liability they couldn't afford to lose. Johnny treated her like a prized secret. He introduced her to the finer things, not because she asked, but because control often looked like generosity. He bought her jewelry, whispered plans over candlelight, and told her things that most men in his business wouldn't dare share with a woman. He trusted her, and that trust, whether she wanted it or not, became a burden. It was through Johnny that Judith first learned about the strange alliance forming between the mob and certain factions in the U.S. government. Whispers of Cuba, of casino interests, of Castro, all swirling in smoky backrooms. The mob had lost their golden island when Castro rose to power, shutting down their casinos and cutting off millions in profits. Now they wanted it back. And the government, desperate for influence in Latin America, needed help from men who knew how to make things happen quietly. That's when Johnny brought up a name, someone who could move mountains with a single phone call: Jack Kennedy. At first, Judith didn't believe it. The young senator? The handsome man with the movie star grin and the perfect speeches about freedom and progress? What would a man like that have to do with mobsters and secret deals? But Johnny just smiled. "In this town, sweetheart," he told her, "everybody's connected. Some just pretend they ain't." Their worlds collided at a party in Las Vegas, a party where the music was too loud, the laughter too rehearsed, and the air thick with smoke and promises. Judith remembered the way Kennedy's presence changed the energy of the room. He had that magnetic ease, People leaned toward him, wanted to be near him. When he laughed, it didn't sound forced. When he looked at you, it felt like you were the only person alive. He noticed her almost immediately. It wasn't lust at first, it was curiosity. She wasn't like the starlets who usually orbited his world. There was a stillness to her, a quiet intelligence. She spoke little, but when she did, it mattered. That night, they talked in a corner, away from the noise. He asked about her life, her work, her thoughts on politics. She deflected with grace, answering without ever really revealing. Kennedy admired that. He had met too many people eager to impress him. Judith's restraint made her unforgettable. When the night ended, he asked for her number. She hesitated, but Johnny's approving nod from across the room sealed it. The bridge was built. What Judith didn't know was that she had just stepped into the most dangerous role of her life, the middle link between America's most powerful politician and its most ruthless criminals. Their first phone call came days later. Kennedy's voice was calm, deliberate, almost hypnotic. They spoke of nothing, books, music, the weather, but underneath there was something electric. Within weeks, she was flying out to meet him privately. At first, she thought it was a fling, the same old story of a powerful man and the woman he couldn't resist. But soon, she realized she was being drawn into something much larger. Kennedy's rise was meteoric. By 1960, he was running for president, and the country adored him. But behind the public charm was a private world built on fragile alliances. Johnny and his associates saw opportunity. A man like Kennedy could be useful. If he remembered who helped him climb, Judith became the conduit. She carried messages, sometimes coded, sometimes casual. A dinner invitation here, a private meeting there. She didn't always understand what the messages meant, but she knew enough to sense their weight. Each trip, each phone call, blurred the lines further between intimacy and espionage. The deeper she went, the less she slept. The glamour was fading, replaced by anxiety that felt like a shadow following her home. She'd hear Johnny's voice in her ear, reminding her that everything she did was for the good of the cause. But whose cause? She wasn't sure anymore. The more Kennedy's star rose, the more dangerous her position became. Reporters sniffed around, asking questions. FBI agents began showing up at places she'd been, asking about a woman connected to certain associates. She started noticing the same black car parked near her apartment, the same unfamiliar faces in hotel lobbies, and yet, when Jack called, she always answered. He'd talk about the pressure, the weight of public life, the loneliness. She'd listen. Sometimes she thought he really loved her. Not the fantasy, but her. Other times, she felt like a beautiful lie he told himself between speeches. One night, in a Washington hotel suite, she asked him if he was afraid of what might happen if people found out. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Everyone in this town is afraid, Judy," he said softly. "That's how you know they're alive." It was the first time she saw the cracks beneath his perfect image, and it terrified her. After that night, their meetings became more careful, more secretive. Sometimes she'd be flown in quietly under an alias. Sometimes she'd meet an associate first, one who always seemed to know too much about where she'd been. Once, she even overheard a conversation she wasn't supposed to, a discussion about Cuba, about handling the situation through unofficial channels. She began to realize she wasn't just a lover. She was a line in the middle of a deal too large to comprehend. By the time Kennedy took the oath of office, Judith's life had split into two realities. In one, she was the woman in love with America's golden boy. In the other, she was the mob's silent courier, trusted by men who could erase her name from history with a single phone call. The parties, the champagne, the hotel suites, all of it began to feel like a performance she could no longer escape. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman she didn't recognize. Someone too deep in to turn back, but too visible to disappear. Late one night, Johnny visited her in person. He poured her a drink, looked her in the eyes, and said, "You're in the middle of something, Judy. Don't forget which side you're on." She didn't answer, because she didn't know anymore. What began as an introduction at a party had become a labyrinth of lies, where the mob, the government, and the heart of a president were bound by one woman's silence. Judith had opened the doors to power, but she was about to learn that every door in that world closes hard, and never without a price. By the early 1960s, the world had fallen in love with John F. Kennedy. The smile, the speeches, the promise of a new America. He was the image of youth and power. But behind the polished surface of Camelot, shadows moved quietly, stitching together a story that would never make it into history books. And at the heart of those shadows was Judith Exner. She had become more than just a name in his private call log. She was a secret, one guarded so fiercely that even those closest to the president never spoke of her. To the public, she didn't exist, but in private, her presence was undeniable. She was there when the phone rang late at night. She was there when the president needed a voice that didn't belong to politics or duty. Their affair was a dangerous mix of passion and paranoia. Judith never knew when the next call would come. Sometimes it would be from Jack himself, his voice soft, measured, calling her Judy like it was their little secret. Other times it came from a man she didn't know, telling her what flight to take, what name to use, which door to enter. Everything was planned, everything watched. Even her silence had a schedule. And then, there was the other side of her life, the mob. Johnny Rosselli still kept close watch over her, though now the warmth in his tone had cooled into something sharper. He reminded her that she was part of something larger, something involving men with far more to lose than a president's reputation. Sam Giancana's name came up more often now. Giancana, the Chicago boss, unpredictable, volatile, and dangerously clever. He was obsessed with power and control, and when Judith's name came up in conversations about Kennedy, he took a particular interest. She didn't meet Giancana right away. For a while, he was just a ghost in the stories Rosselli told. But when she finally did, she understood why everyone feared him. He had a calmness that was almost worse than rage, the kind of man who could smile while deciding your fate. He called her baby in that old-fashioned menacing way. And behind his charm, she could feel the weight of what he represented, the underworld's reach into the highest office in the land. It was Giancana who pushed for Judith to act as a messenger between him and Kennedy's circle. The idea terrified her. She wasn't a spy. She was a woman in love. But love in her world had long ago stopped being simple. She carried notes, small folded papers that meant nothing to her, but everything to the men exchanging them. Sometimes it was just a name, sometimes a location, sometimes she didn't even want to know. Each delivery made her heart beat faster, her palms slick. She told herself it was for Jack, that she was helping him, helping his country, helping the peace he talked about so often. But deep down, she knew she was helping men who played by their own rules. The CIA, the mob, and the White House, three forces colliding in a quiet war against Fidel Castro. Plans whispered in backrooms, cigars burning slow while deals were made in plain sight. Judith was the unseen courier connecting it all. She remembered one night in particular. Washington, 1962, a storm raged outside. She sat in a hotel room waiting. The phone rang, one of those untraceable calls that came with no warning. The voice on the other end was one she recognized instantly. It was Giancana. "Did you deliver the message?" he asked. "Yes," she said quietly. A pause. "Good girl," he murmured. "Now listen, Judy. If anyone ever asks, you don't know me. You don't know any of us. Understand?" She nodded, though he couldn't see her. When the line went dead, she poured herself a drink, hands trembling. She'd been told those words before, but this time they felt like a threat, not a reminder. Her relationship with Kennedy began to change, too. He had grown distant. The pressures of the presidency, the Bay of Pigs, the mounting Cold War tension, all of it weighed on him. Their meetings became shorter, less frequent, but the danger only grew. Judith sensed that their affair was no longer private. She'd see men in suits outside her apartment, not talking, just watching. She once asked Jack if the FBI knew about them. He smiled that practiced political smile and said, "They know about everything, Judy. The question is, what they choose to care about." That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about what Rosselli had said long ago. Everyone in power needs someone to hold their secrets. Just make sure you're not the one holding too many. Then came the phone call that would change everything. It wasn't from Kennedy. It was from one of his associates, someone she barely knew. The message was short and cold. "You need to stop coming to the White House. No explanation. No goodbye. Just an order. At first, she thought it was about security, maybe politics. But then she saw the headlines, the growing attention around Kennedy's private life, the murmurs of extramarital affairs, the tension between his administration and the mob. She realized the walls were closing in, and she wasn't the only one noticing. Giancana was furious. He felt betrayed. He believed the Kennedys had used them, during the election and the Cuba operations, then turned their backs once they got what they wanted. The mob had helped secure votes, funded favors, and looked the other way when convenient. Now Bobby Kennedy, the president's brother and attorney general, had declared open war on organized crime. It was the ultimate betrayal, and Judith, standing between both worlds, was caught in the crossfire. Her phone began to ring at odd hours again, not with romance, but with warnings. Some came from Rosselli, others from strangers. Keep quiet. Stay out of sight. Don't answer questions. She started burning letters, hiding photographs, and avoiding familiar faces. She stopped wearing her favorite perfume because it reminded her of nights she could no longer talk about. The affair was over, but its consequences had only begun. In 1963, she received a final call, a voice she hadn't heard in months. It was Jack. He sounded tired, older somehow. They spoke briefly about nothing and everything. There was a pause before he said, "You were always kind to me, Judy. Don't let them change that." Those were the last words she'd ever hear from him. Months later, he was gone. Dallas. The shots. The chaos. The silence. Judith watched it unfold on television, her glass trembling in her hand. The man she'd loved, the man she'd risked everything for, was gone in an instant, and the world mourned him like a saint. But Judith knew better. Saints don't have shadows this long. After the funeral, she walked through her apartment, the air thick with the ghosts of conversations that could never be repeated. Somewhere out there, men were deciding how much of her story would survive, and how much would disappear with the others. The mob stayed quiet. Washington stayed silent. And Judith Exner, the woman who had once walked through the doors of power, vanished into the margins of history. But those who knew the truth never forgot her, because in the world of power and politics, the most dangerous people are never the ones in front of the camera. They're the ones who were told to stay in the dark. The affair was over. The president was dead, but the silence Judith carried, that dangerous, heavy silence, would outlive them all. When power collapses, it doesn't make a sound right away. It starts with whispers, the same kind Judith had built her life around. By the time the noise reaches the world, the walls have already fallen. After Kennedy's assassination, Judith Exner's world was hollowed out. The man who had once called her Judy in soft, secret tones was now a face on black and white footage, frozen forever in that open-top car in Dallas. The country mourned a leader, but Judith mourned something else entirely, a ghost she could never speak of. The phone stopped ringing. The men who once courted her attention now avoided her entirely. Johnny Rosselli vanished into his own shadows. Giancana was paranoid and volatile. And Washington, the Washington that once called her into its quiet rooms, wanted nothing more than to forget she ever existed. Judith tried to live a normal life again, but normal was something that no longer fit. The press had begun circling. Rumors about Kennedy's private life were leaking out, piece by piece. There were names, stories, and half-truths, but none more dangerous than hers. At first, she denied everything. When journalists called, she hung up. When strange men followed her car, she drove in circles until she lost them. She told herself it would all fade, that she could disappear into the background like smoke. But secrets, especially those tied to power, have a way of resurfacing, no matter how deep you bury them. By the late 1960s, the political tides were shifting again. America was drowning in scandal, Vietnam, protests, corruption, and the ghosts of the past began to stir. Investigators reopened cases. Journalists hunted for untold truths, and suddenly, the name Judith Exner began appearing in conversations again. They called her the mystery woman, the one who might have known too much, the one who connected the White House to the underworld, the one whose silence had protected both. Judith tried to stay quiet, but the world had changed. The same system that once used her silence now demanded her confession. In 1975, the U.S. Senate opened investigations into organized crime and covert CIA operations. The lines between politics and criminal enterprise were being redrawn, and somehow her name surfaced again. Her story, once buried under layers of denial, was suddenly alive, clawing its way back into the light. One day her phone rang again, but this time it wasn't Kennedy or Rosselli. It was a journalist. "Miss Exner," the voice said, calm and rehearsed. "We know you had a relationship with the president. We also know about your meetings with Sam Giancana. Would you like to comment before we publish?" Judith didn't answer. She just hung up and sat there for a long time, the receiver still warm against her palm. She had always been careful, always protected. But in that moment she realized there was no one left to protect her now. The story broke like wildfire. The mob's mistress. The president's secret lover. The headlines painted her as everything from a spy to a traitor to a tragic romantic figure. The truth, of course, was far less cinematic, but far more dangerous. Reporters hounded her. Old photographs surfaced, her at political events, in hotel lobbies, beside men whose names she never dared speak aloud. The FBI reopened files. Senators whispered her name in hearings, and the public, always hungry for scandal, wanted to know who she was, what she knew, and how deep the corruption really ran. Judith had a choice: keep denying, or finally tell the truth. And she did talk, though not the way the world expected. In interviews and testimony, she confirmed what many had suspected. She had been romantically involved with John F. Kennedy. She had also, at Rosselli's request, arranged meetings between Kennedy and Giancana. She had delivered messages. She had been part of something bigger than she could ever fully understand. But the moment she spoke, she became radioactive. The government dismissed her statements as unsubstantiated. Political figures distanced themselves. Former associates vanished. The mob stayed quiet, too quiet. She wasn't a threat to them anymore, but she wasn't one of them either. She was something worse, a liability. Rosselli was later found dead, stuffed into an oil drum and dumped off the coast of Florida. Giancana, too, was murdered, shot in the mouth in his own kitchen before he could testify. To those who knew the rules of that world, the message was clear. Loose ends don't live long. Judith read about their deaths in the paper. She didn't cry. She just poured herself a drink, sat on her balcony, and stared out at the empty sky. The world she once belonged to had devoured itself. In the years that followed, Judith tried to reclaim her life. She painted, she wrote. She gave occasional interviews, her voice calm but distant, as if speaking about someone else's life. The press predictably twisted her words. Some called her a liar, others called her a hero, but most just forgot her once the headlines faded. Behind closed doors, though, the scars never healed. She lived with a paranoia that never left her, checking windows, double-locking doors, scanning faces in every crowd. She knew too much. And even though the world had moved on, she could never shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, still had her name circled in red ink. Her health declined over the years, worn down by stress, fear, and the kind of loneliness that comes from outliving your own secrets. When she spoke about Kennedy, her tone softened, not like a woman clinging to lost love, but like someone remembering a moment of light in a very long tunnel. "I loved him," she once said in an interview, her voice trembling slightly. "But I don't think he ever really belonged to anyone, not even to himself." Those words lingered, more honest than any headline, more tragic than any myth. In the end, Judith Exner became a ghost, not just in the story of the mob or the White House, but in the American memory itself, a symbol of how far power will go to protect its own, and how easily those caught between can be erased. History would try to simplify her, to box her in as the mistress, the messenger, the scandal. But she was more than that. She was the thread that, when pulled, exposed a whole tapestry of corruption, control and consequence, and for that, she paid the price. By the time the cameras stopped calling, Judith Exner had become a woman out of place and out of time. She had loved the wrong man, trusted the wrong promises, and held secrets that reshaped history. But in the end, all she ever wanted was to be forgotten, and that perhaps was the one wish the world was all too happy to grant her. They say history is written by the victors, but in Judith Exner's case, It was written by men who needed her gone. When the headlines turned cold and the photographs faded, the world quietly folded her story into the archives of scandal, the kind that's whispered about in bars but never taught in classrooms. She became a ghost in the margins of history books, a name replaced by alleged mistress, political distraction, or worse, liar. But the truth, the real, unpolished truth, was that Judith Exner had stood at the intersection of power and danger, and survived it. By the late 1970s, Judith was a shadow of her former self. Gone were the tailored dresses, the diamond earrings, the smoky clubs where powerful men leaned close to whisper secrets in her ear. Now, she lived quietly in California, battling illness and the kind of loneliness that eats through a person like rust. The mob had long turned its gaze elsewhere, and the political elite had erased her name from polite conversation. Yet, the echo of what she knew, what she might still reveal, lingered like a chill in the corridors of Washington. She had once loved a man who could change nations with a phone call. She had once trusted another who ruled cities with fear and silence. Between them, she had been a messenger, a pawn, and for a fleeting moment, a queen. But power never shares its throne for long. When journalists came knocking years later, she no longer had the same spark. She spoke softly, carefully, like someone walking through a minefield of memory. "I was young," she said once in an interview, "and I believed I was helping the man I loved." Her voice trembled as she added, "I never knew how deep it went." The interviewer asked if she regretted anything. Judith smiled faintly, that old Hollywood smile, the one that once charmed presidents and gangsters alike, and said, "I regret believing that love and power could ever live in the same room." Behind her eyes, though, there was still that flicker, the one that had once caught the attention of John F. Kennedy and Sam Giancana alike. It was the flicker of someone who had seen too much, survived too much, and knew that the story the world told about her was only half the truth. For years after JFK's assassination, conspiracy theories swirled. Some claimed Judith was a link between the president and the mob, that she carried messages, facilitated deals, or perhaps even warnings. Others said she knew about plots, that she was used as an intermediary in backroom arrangements between political power and criminal influence. The truth was murky, tangled in rumors, redacted files, and whispers from men long dead. Judith always denied being a conspirator. "I wasn't part of any scheme," she once told a reporter. "I was part of a love story. That turned into something else. But that's the cruel trick of history. It doesn't care about feelings. It only remembers the noise, the scandal, the headlines that sell. And in those headlines, Judith Exner was not a woman who loved. She was the mistress, the seductress, the liability." In the years after her death, declassified FBI documents and memoirs of political insiders hinted that Judith's story was far more complicated than the tabloids ever let on. There were phone logs, meeting records, secret correspondences, all suggesting that her role wasn't just romantic. She was part of a network of influence, one that connected America's most powerful office to its most dangerous men. But perhaps the most tragic part of Judith's life wasn't the scandal. It was how she was discarded once her usefulness ended. The men she loved, the men who used her, the men who feared her, they all moved on. Their legacies remained intact, sculpted in marble and history books. Hers, meanwhile, was buried under a mountain of shame. Yet in her final years, Judith found a kind of peace. She started painting. She gardened. She stopped reading the news. For once, her hands, the same hands that once held notes meant for the president, held something living, something that didn't demand secrecy or sacrifice. She found solace not in redemption, but in quiet acceptance. There was a strange dignity to the way she disappeared. No grand confessions, no tell-all books, just silence. The same kind of silence that had surrounded her life from the very beginning. Maybe she understood something the rest of us didn't, that some stories aren't meant to be rewritten. Some are meant to linger, to haunt. Even today, when historians debate the connections between organized crime and American politics of the 1960s, Judith's name surfaces like a ghost. Always in half sentences, always in cautious tones. She is the woman no one wants to admit mattered, but everyone knows did. Because deep down, everyone understands what she represented. Judith Exner wasn't just a mistress. She was proof that the most dangerous alliances are not formed in smoke-filled rooms or blood-soaked streets, but in bedrooms, whispered in the dark, under the illusion of love, and maybe that's why her story still matters. It reminds us that corruption doesn't always wear a suit or carry a gun. Sometimes it smiles softly, kisses you goodnight, and promises forever. As the credits of her life rolled quietly to black, Judith Exner remained one of America's most enigmatic figures, the woman who knew too much, loved too deeply, and paid the price for both. She never sought revenge, never demanded justice. Instead, she carried her truth alone, like a final act of defiance. When she passed away in 1999, there was no headline. No tribute, no mourning from the halls of power, just a brief obituary, a few lines to mark the end of a woman who had once danced with history itself. But maybe that's how Judith would have wanted it. No spectacle, no noise, just silence and the faint memory of what once was. Because even if history tried to erase her, the shadows still remember. The whispers still linger. And somewhere in the smoky haze of time, Judith Exner still sits between two worlds, the mob and the White House, her story too dangerous to tell, yet too haunting to forget. So when you hear stories about presidents and gangsters, remember her. Remember the woman who walked the line between love and treason, who saw the cost of power up close and paid it in full. And remember that behind every legend, there's always someone the world chose to forget.